Okay, welcome back to Race, Place, and Inequality. Make sure the microphone. All right, cool. All right, so this week, September 13th through the 17th, we're going to be discussing policing interracial sex, doing some things around policing interracial sex, and Jim Crow state of mind. So those are the two let's see. Jim Crow state of mind. Just want to make sure that we have that down here. Yeah, policing interracial sex and Jim Crow state of mind. And sorry, it's not September 13th through the 17th, it's September 13th through the 15th. If that's right, this one, yeah, this class is a little different. So yeah, September 13th through the 15th, policing interracial sex and Jim Crow state of mind. So we're going to talk about both of those in this lecture video today. With that being said, if you have any questions about your video assignment or your web assignments or discussions or anything like that, please let me know. I've only had a few people inbox me. Usually somebody who has a video assignment coming up, they may come into my inbox or office hours just to let me know, have questions or whatever. But it seems like everybody seems to understand what's going on with the class. The assignments are pretty straightforward. What it is that you have to do, it's pretty straightforward. So yeah, but if you do, you can always email me, or easiest thing to do is just slide in my office hours and talk about it real quick, and then we can keep it moving. With that being said, I like to start this lecture off with a quote from a documentary about historically Black colleges and universities called Tell Them We Are Rising. And it says, and for the first time, the community was confronted with Negroes in places where they had never been, right? And so this topic, and really the class, but particularly this topic, is this idea of being in and out of places, right? And the way in which people, particularly Black people, being in and out of places, how that works from a racial standpoint. And then later on, as we get into the Jim Crow state of mind, which you should have read that article, you'll start to see how this also works in terms of class and gender, et cetera. So just to do a quick recap from last week, where we talked about the introduction to Spatializing Blackness and overall what the book was about and what you could expect. Talked a little bit about crossroad power. So just to do a quick recap of that, in this first chapter, Rashad Shabazz discusses crossroad power, and he is discussing the ways in which race and place divide power between people. People who are used to confine people to that place, and then people who resist that confinement and resist the power structures that are put in place to survey and provide surveillance over that place. And so crossroad power, we talked about that with Michel Foucault. So we don't have to go into too much more detail about that. If you need a reminder, look at the previous lecture video towards the end, and that's where we talk about Foucault. You can also look at that video that talks about Foucault as well. I think I put up a link to a video about Foucault's Discipline and Punish. So crossroad power is the punishment and discipline, or how punishment and discipline becomes internalized and directed to the Constitution, and when necessary, rehabilitation of social subjects. It is the practice of social control and discipline over its population in all areas of social life. And so what Foucault argues is that the overall suggestion was the French government said or prided itself on being much more moral and much more civilized than they were during the French Revolution and before. They said things like, we don't cut people's heads off anymore. We're not running around putting people's heads on stakes in the front of the city to scare people off. Those are barbaric means of punishment. We don't participate in that anymore. So they were kind of puffed up and felt like they were doing better, right, than all these other countries, right? And what Michel Foucault is saying is, nah, y'all not, right? Y'all think y'all better, but the way in which you punish people out loud and in public is actually worse now, because now you do it in private behind closed doors. People don't know what's going on behind these big prisons. If you've ever been to a prison, if you've ever driven by one, you'll see it has a lot of gates, it's a lot of walls. You have to go through a lot of different checkpoints before you can actually enter into the prison. So we really don't even know what kind of torture goes on. And that's why prison reform can be so difficult to, number one, catch and find out and then actually change, because it's so confined, it's so spatialized, and it's so secretive. So a lot of times you don't know what's going on behind those prisons unless you've actually been to prison. And by then, many times you're a victim of that oppression, you're a victim of those issues. And so it then gets hard to try to tell people on the outside what's going on to get people to actually change. It can be difficult to get cameras in there to actually see what's going on. And so that's one of the things that Foucault was talking about. But another thing he talks about is how the regular social life was so much more free. It was so much more liberating. And he kind of goes into it in the previous book. I forgot the name of it, but he's critiquing the medical industry. And he talks a little bit about how so-called crazy people and in the ancient times, or even in pre-modern times, would just kind of be allowed to roam in the village, right? As long as they weren't hurting people, as long as they weren't disrupting society, people just kind of ignored them and they just kind of roamed around. But in this day and age, they are actually put institutions, institutionalized, shot up with certain types of drugs. They're chained to the bed. They can, and I don't know if you've ever seen this movie, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, with Jack Nicholson. It's an old movie, like maybe back in the 70s or something like that. But it showed how people were treated in mental facilities. And it was torture. Like, it was literally torture. And this was maybe a little bit before the time Foucault was writing these words. And so he's basically saying you're actually doing worse to people than when you just let them kind of roam and be free. And so he's saying the same thing in this case. He's saying that the way in which you punish people and the way in which you control people was generally done within the confines of carcerality, right? It was done within the confines of prisons. And now you've actually taken those same ideas and those same ways of punishment and strategy and these kind of religious, and when I say religious, I'm just saying you're doing the same things over and over. And now you've applied it to other parts of social life, including schools, the military, other aspects of social life. And he breaks it down where he talks about how people are placed in these like box-like physical spaces, and he talks about how schools are these box-like physical. Like, he goes into detail and compares it, right? And the distribution of people and how people are ranked, right? So you have this ranking system in prisons. You also have a ranking system in schools, freshmen, sophomores, juniors, seniors. You have a ranking system in the military. You have, I believe it's called a P1, a P2, you may have a captain, a lieutenant, sergeant, whatever. And so the same ways in which we have controlled people in prisons, we've now applied to every aspect of society. And that's what he calls carceral power. Going to the next point. So public space is transformed into defendable space with the installation of walls, gates, fences, surveillance, cameras, and security checkpoints. And so that's essentially what is happening with carceral power. Michel Foucault is saying that the public spaces that used to kind of be free for people to roam, for people to be themselves, have now become these defendable spaces. So even when you talk about neighborhoods, now neighborhoods have these installations, they have these walls, they have these gates, they have these fences. And sometimes we might look at that as being good and secure to keep people out. But kind of what Foucault is saying is, what messages are we sending when we put up these gates and when we put up these fences, especially in certain places? If you have a predominantly white, upper class space, it's kind of telling other people you're not good enough to come in here, right? If it's in projects or in ghettos, oftentimes those gates are put up not to keep people out, but to keep people in. There is a song, I don't know. There's a rap song by a group called Outkast, and there's a song they were with another group called Goody Mob, and there was a rapper in the group called CeeLo Green, and CeeLo has a song where he's talking about living in the projects, and he's talking about living in apartments and project buildings. And he, at the end of the verse, he says, "I don't know if the gates were put up to keep crime out or keep our ass in." And so what he's arguing is that, are they trying to protect us from the crime that's happening in our community? Or are they trying to leave the crime in our community so that it doesn't go outside of our community into the Black middle class communities or the white communities? So it's actually quite an interesting scenario. And you know what? I probably should have had y'all listen to that song and then analyze it, but whatever. Maybe we can do that another time, because the whole song has a lot to do with race and place and space and class. So again, public spaces that used to be open and free, if you look at movies or documentaries or whatever, with villages and or even if you talk about pre-modern United States, right? It was just the way we lived was much more free and interactive than it is now, right? Where you have you have surveillance everywhere. Now it's not uncommon for you to live in a neighborhood where there are hidden cameras all over the place that's supposed to be there to keep you safe. So with that being said, now we come to Rashad Shabazz. So Michel Foucault talks about all of this in the 1970s. And so now Rashad Shabazz, who is a professor at the University of Chicago, in 2016 releases this book. And he says, well, this is, I like what Foucault is saying. How can we apply this same notion of carceral power to what Black people are going through in housing, right? When it comes to living in public housing, predominantly poor communities, and in places and spaces where so many people are forced to live in these very these high-rise buildings that don't have a lot of space to them, and they're forced to stay there. And so he applies this idea of carceral power to neighborhood districts and housing. And so he first starts by talking about sex districts, right? Talking about sex districts. And so sex districts were popular. And this is, you're talking about the 1920s, 1930s. So this is the Roaring 20s era. If you know anything about that, if you come from Africana studies, you may be familiar with the Harlem Renaissance and the creation of jazz. Maybe you've seen movies or documentaries on jazz music, the birth of jazz. And so you have these speakeasies, you have these saloons where people are coming to drink. At the time, alcohol was illegal. And so people would come to drink and they would enjoy a show. And there would be women in scantily clad outfits with short skirts, and it was very sexual, right? It was these places where people would get, hot and bothered. And then there were other areas, maybe in the back of the club or maybe in another house or something, where people could go and they could have sex. Now, generally speaking, these were racially segregated times. So there was no living in the same neighborhood in terms of race. There were very few integrated Black and white neighborhoods, integrated Black and white schools, or even churches or things like that. But the sex districts were very much integrated because people said, hey, I don't necessarily want to live next to a person of color or go to school with a Black person or go to church with a Black person, but I don't mind having sex with a Black person. And so there were these types of interactions that occurred. And more often than not, the sex would be transactional. So, you give me money, I give you sex. So you had these, these whorehouses, right? As sometimes they were called during those times, these whorehouses or these, there's a B, I think it's not bordello, brothel, we call brothels. And so these sex districts were popular and used spaces as spaces for people to carry out their sexual fantasies, right? And so a lot of times during these times, people looked at these sex districts as not only places where people would carry out their fantasies, but also areas of debauchery. Debauchery. I think people say debauchery. I think that's how you say it. Debauchery and, unrighteousness. And so people who were more Christian, people who were more conservative didn't like these sex districts. And regulating these districts was the beginning of this prison-like power over Black people. Because if you look at where these districts were located in predominantly Black areas. They were located in the Black Belt of Chicago, right? And Chicago wasn't the only place to have these sex districts. There were these kinds of sex districts happening in cities all over. There were definitely some in Jacksonville. And just knowing about the history of Jacksonville, I'm familiar with the fact that there were places where there was obviously a separation between white and Black people in the city of Jacksonville, but then also in Jacksonville, there were these clubs, more so on the north side of Jacksonville, where white people could come, enjoy some jazz music, they could drink, and they could have sex with Black people. And so this was the start of initiating the prison-like power. Rashad Shabazz argues that the way in which police officers, and he talks later about a particular police officer called Nudabar, the way in which these police officers began to enact this power, we know had everything to do with race and place. And it had nothing to do with the actual morality of it. Because if we're honest, I don't think people necessarily had a problem with the sex itself as much as where it was taking place and how we could use this as an excuse to over-police and provide hyper surveillance for these areas. And so sometimes it was this idea of, well, we want to make sure that we're maintaining Christian moral values. But if that was the case, then it takes two people to have sex, interracial sex. It takes the person of color and the non-person of color. And so if you're going to provide hyper surveillance for the people of color in their community, why not do the same for the white people in their community if that is what it is about, right? So clearly it wasn't, because there was no hyper policing, there was no hyper surveillance, there was no carceral or prison-like power put in place over the white people in their communities when they would come over to the Black communities and come to these saloons and come to these sex districts in the Black Belt. And so we know that it was about race, place, and it was also about power over a specific group. It had nothing to do with the vices themselves, but the interracial relationships around it. And so the vice itself of having sex was sure could have been a problem, and maybe people wanted people to only have sex within a marriage, only have sex with their wives or their husbands. But the interracial part, of course, was a problem for a lot of people. A lot of people did not like the fact that Black people and white people were having sex with each other. But then the larger issue is, but then whose fault is it, right? And so then you start to criminalize or hypersexualize a specific group. Well, if the Black person and the white person are having sex with each other, whose fault is it? And who are we going to fix so that this does not happen again? And we're not going to put the blame on whiteness, because then that would make whiteness seem immoral or connected to immorality in some way. So what we're going to say is that it is these Black people, these particularly the Black women, because most of the people who are entering the sex districts from outside the Black community are white men. And so what's happening is they are entering into these Black spaces, and these Black women, with their bodies and with their sexuality and with their liquor and with their jazz, they're drawing these men in, and they're, enticing them, and these white men are having sex with them and not realizing what they're doing, and they're moving away from the morality of what it means to be an American, a Christian, a middle-class Protestant person, right? And so then you have the hypersexualization as well as the hypercriminalization of this community and of these people, right? So there was the issue with the interracial relationships, but the issue was not necessarily with the white people having sex with the Black people, but the Black people enticing with their innate immoral hypersexual behaviors, drawing these white people in to their Black belts in their places and spaces so that they could, do these lewd acts. And so, something else I wanted to say. Oh yeah. So then in doing that, labeling these people hypersexual, labeling these people hypercriminal was the way in which, or it gave justification for now passing policies and now legalizing the confinement and the containment of Black people in a particular space and place, right? This is not new. This goes all the way back to slavery, right? Where again, and I always forget what class I talk about what, but we may have talked about how with the formation of slavery and African people being enslaved for a lifetime in the United States, that came about as in stages. So initially, they were brought over as indentured servants. When the indentured servitude made a profit, but not as much profit as being a slave, then they started to ensure policies and create policies that allowed for African people to be enslaved for life. They could no longer just work for a few years and then they would be free, like normal slavery during that time. In the ancient times, it was more of an indentured servitude. But then what started to happen is the white men started raping the African women, right, on the plantations. And so they were creating these mixed race babies. And so also the white men who are doing this are also the friends or the people that are running the towns, they're running the villages, they're creating the laws. And so now they're saying, well, what we need to do is we need to find a way or create a way for us to deal with this new population of mixed race people, because these babies that are being born and now becoming kids and adults, they're Black or white. So are we going to allow them to be free? And initially they did, right? If you were born mixed race, then you would be free. They didn't realize how many mixed race kids was going to happen because of this the hypersexualization of the white male. And so because of that, they then created laws that said that a person who was born of mixed race has to take on the status of the mother. Now that did two things. First thing it did was that it allowed for white men to, and this was done because they said that African women were naturally hypersexual, and they use dances and culture that they saw in Africa, where these women were, some of them will walk around with bare chested, or they may do dances where they would shake their breasts, but they may shake, their bottom areas and things like that. And so these were ways in which white European men who didn't see this in their culture said, oh, these people must be hypersexual. They must have sex a lot. They're walking around. They're allowing women to walk around with their breasts out. And there were reasons for that around the geography. There were reasons for these dances. Many of them were dances to the fertile gods that they were doing. So it was out of this kind of religious ceremony where they would do these dances. But because these European men didn't know that, they automatically assumed that these women were hypersexual. And so then they used that, and when they were brought over to the Americas, they automatically associated them with being these hypersexualized beings and worthy of being raped. And so with that happening, that was used to justify why it was okay for white men to use Black women as sexual property, as well as financial property and as a commodity. And so the policies that they passed were twofold. It controlled the sexuality of, well, actually threefold. It controlled the sexuality of three people. It allowed for more liberal sexuality for white men to be able to sleep with their white wives and these enslaved African women. It also controlled the sexuality of the white woman because she could not practice that same thing, and that if she got pregnant by an enslaved Black male, that could mess up the economy because her child would be free, but his child would be enslaved. So it would not affect the slave economy. And in fact, it would help it because now instead of going to buy more enslaved Africans, I could just rape these African women and make them for free, right? So it controlled the sexual, or it made for much more liberal sexuality for the white male. It controlled the sexuality of the white woman so that she would only for financial purposes, only have sex with or get pregnant by the white male. And then obviously it controlled the sexuality of the Black woman all the way around so that she had no control over her body. And so these kinds of things happen over time. You go to Civil War, abolitionism, 13th Amendment, slavery is done away with, blah, blah, blah. But these still practices of controlling bodies and controlling bodies in certain places and spaces, these are the things that continue on in the American tradition and gets carried out even in more modern times, like the 1920s and 1930s during the jazz era, where Chicago police, law enforcement, and policies were used to control the sexuality of interracial sex, control and use policies to not only do that, but also keep people confined to a space. So I just told that story just to show that this is not a new phenomenon, but this controlling interracial sex through power, through policies, through space is something that was done all the way back in slavery, even up until now. Well, until then, and I imagine in some ways even now. Okay, so space, where are we? Had nothing to do, yes. So we're to the third bullet. Space is significant to morale because it defines what is socially acceptable. And so when we think about space, we think about how when you enter into certain spaces, you know what is socially acceptable, right? For example, if you're coming to class, right? If you were coming to class physically, you may wear something, you may dress up or you may not, right? Because the space doesn't necessarily call for that. So it's socially acceptable to be able to dress down when you're coming to class, to be able to wear some shorts and a shirt or some pants. You don't necessarily have to dress up. But if you were to go to court, it would be socially acceptable for you because of the space to dress up, right? Because you're going to court. It's so interesting. I just thought about this, even in the digital space, right? Space is significant to morale because it defines what is socially acceptable. Because, for example, even in this digital space, even though I'm not seeing you in person, right? And in this case, I'm not interacting with you in person, it would be socially unacceptable for me to come to this lecture video, even though it's being recorded, in my pajamas, right? I'll be socially unacceptable. You may look at that and say, why is Dr. Grant wearing his pajamas or wearing a jersey and some basketball shorts? It might look weird, right? Even though I'm at home, right? Even though I may be at home, or even if I'm in my office or wherever, the fact that this is done, or the fact that the space, even though the space is digital, it represents a college campus, I should dress up when I'm doing a lecture video. At the very least, wear a polo. At the very least, wear a button-up shirt or something to show that although this is digital, this is representative of the college space, which defines what is socially acceptable. Because if I was in a classroom with you physically, I would not come wearing pajamas, or I would not come wearing a jersey and some basketball shorts. I would have to come to some degree dressed up. May not have to be a suit and tie, but I need to be dressed up to some degree. So again, space is significant to morale because it defines what is socially acceptable. And so these nightclubs were called Black and Tans. And these Black and Tan nightclubs were places, again, where white people and Black people would meet, interact, socialize, drink, dance, listen to music. And the reasons why this lasted so long was because they were in the Black communities. And so white people had to go inside the Black community to participate in the deviance, meaning they had to enter into the Black space to participate in any deviance they wanted to participate in. Why? Because the people who were seen as being naturally deviant were the Black people. And the white people, though they were participating in deviance, were still automatically, legally, and through other means of philosophy and thought, seen as being naturally good. So if whiteness is naturally good, white people are naturally good, they're not gonna participate in deviance, but these people are naturally bad, naturally evil, always unrighteous, always criminal, then it would make sense for these immoral spaces to be in their communities and not in white communities. And if white people go there, it's because they were enticed, not because that's naturally who they are, right? And so they had to enter into Black spaces to participate in deviance because Blackness is innately deviant, right? And so this is what spatializing Blackness does, and this is what Rashad Shabazz does to kind of lay out the philosophies around what is getting ready to happen with Noodle Bar, what's getting ready to happen with these officers, what's getting ready to happen with how this was justified as a reason why we need to hyper police and provide hyper surveillance within these communities. And so we go into the next section, Noodle Bar and the creation of whiteness. And if you go to your book, Spatializing Blackness, this is pages 17 and 18. And so it talks a little bit about Noodle Bar and the Chicago police, right? Okay, so starting, I think it's important for us to conceptualize whiteness when we talk about Noodle Bar. Max Noodle Bar, who is a key officer in this section, who's a German immigrant but becomes an officer in the Chicago Police Department. It's important for us to talk about the creation of how whiteness came to be, because whiteness did not always exist, right? Whiteness is something that's actually fairly new. And so prior to the transatlantic slave trade and things of that nature, again, I think we've talked about this before, African people didn't consider themselves Black. They considered themselves part of whatever nation or village they were a part of, because the whole continent was Black, right? In the same way, whites didn't necessarily consider themselves white. prior to the slave trade, prior to the creation of race, which is a fairly new concept, they didn't call themselves white. They called themselves French, British, German, Italian, Greek, Roman, whatever, right? Now we will call these people white, but at the time, they called themselves wherever they were from. And so this also answers the question why it was that African people participated in the slave trade, because just like the French didn't help the English when the English went to war with somebody, because they're like, that's your people, that don't have anything to do with me. African people looked at other people in various countries and villages in the same way. Those aren't my people, those are your people. If you have issues with these white people, you take it up with them. We're not one, right? And everybody thought that way. There was no such thing as Asian. There was no such thing as white. There was no such thing as black. There was no such thing as any of these. People connected to wherever they were from. And so there was no loyalty to any race, because race didn't exist. There was loyalty to your country, to your king, to your small group of people. And so the idea of race as we know it today is more so tied to evolution and capitalism. And so beginning to speak on how others were chosen before African people, right? You had Native Americans who were chosen as these enslaved people, and then other groups who were chosen as these enslaved people before you finally get to African people. And so, let's see. And so as we're moving forward, and now as enslaved African people are a part of the slave process, and then we just talked about how they became the slaves for life and blah, blah, blah. Now you're starting to create ideas and policies around what is blackness, what is whiteness. So now you have things like the 3/5 Compromise, the Fugitive Slave Act, all of these different things to say, well, blackness is associated with slavery, property, bondage, blah, blah, blah. And then whiteness is associated with freedom, with property, with ownership, blah, 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 right? Now, what whiteness was at that time was still within the context of the United States, right? It was still within the concepts of the United States. And so in looking at the history of white supremacy and looking at the history of colonialism, capitalism, and science, we see that whiteness is associated with all of these things and is explained through all of these things, right? And is confined within the borders of what is considered the United States. So when you talk about white people who are not, so when you're talking about white people who are European, these people are not necessarily considered white. Or if they are, they're this lower kind of standard of white, okay? And so with this lower standard of white, the US white people, the Western whites, if you will, could look at themselves as more superior, okay? Again, talking about the creation of whiteness, we start to see how, I want to say within the middle to the end part of the 19th century, more Europeans are starting to migrate over to the Americas, starting to migrate over to the Americas. So you have Italians, you have Germans, you have Jews, you have Irish, you have all these different people. And when they first get here, they're not treated like American white people. They're not treated like Black people, but they're not treated as well as American white people. They are stuffed in ghettos. In fact, that's where ghettos actually start. Actually started, I think, in Italy, but in terms of the US ghetto, it started in the Americas, with largely Jews and Irish people being pushed into these very small confined spaces where they had to live, and there were multiple families living in these 1 or 2, room spaces, right? And so they were not considered white as in the way that United States, in the way that Americans understood themselves to be white. And this was done for the sake of capital, for the sake of property, for the sake of profit, because now we have this working poor class that is naturally that way, and we can use them, make sure they stay uneducated, make sure that they stay at the bottom, and we can use them as the labor force that is necessary to make the American white upper middle class possible. And then those Black people at the bottom, we can keep them sharecropping, we can keep them working for little to nothing in virtually slavery. We can keep these European immigrants and the poor and working class, and the American whites can continue to thrive. And so a lot of this is about exploitation. It's about exploitation. It's about capitalism. It's about profit. And so as we're moving out of the 19th century and into the 20th century, what you start to see is now that these immigrants are coming to the Americas, and now you have this class system created, essentially what we end up finding is that as more and more European immigrants are coming, they're starting to infiltrate certain parts of white American life, right? They're now allowed to go, and in some ways they go in with the entry-level jobs, with the jobs nobody wants, and then they find themselves being able to have access to job mobility, to education. And once World War I happens, right, and now you have a lot of the US workers who are, the US white men who are now going off to war. This opens up opportunity for Black workers, but then this also opens up opportunity for the immigrant workers. And so now these are the closest thing to white men, right, that we have in our country. They're not gonna go over there. The Germans who left Germany in the 19th century are not gonna go back over there and fight for Germany, in World War I. They're gonna stay here. They're not technically American, so they're not gonna fight for the Americans. They're not eligible to fight for America. So they just have to stay here and work in the factories. But now it's them, and then you also have the Black workers. And they're not gonna give the Black workers jobs over the German workers, or the Black workers jobs over the European workers. That doesn't make sense. So the European workers start to find themselves integrating into whiteness by integrating into the middle class jobs, finding opportunities and leaving the ghettos that they were forced to live in the 19th century. And now they're able to have access to the middle class areas that white people had access to. And by the time these men come back after World War I, they literally just recreate what is called whiteness. And so non-American whites start to become a part of the middle class, and this allows them to be fully white. Now they're going to universities, now they're going to colleges, now they have jobs, now they can contribute to overall society. And now with these Black people who are now leaving the sharecropping and the farming, we need a new labor force. At first it was the European immigrants. Now we put the Black people in the labor force. We pay them less than what we was paying the immigrants. The immigrants can now become white. Now they can be our firefighters. Now they can be our politicians. And guess what? Now they can be our police officers. And so that is how Max Nudibrar, who was a German, integrated into the Chicago police, right? And so now he gets the job as a Chicago police officer, and he's enjoying whiteness. These Europeans are now enjoying whiteness. They're enjoying the benefits of being white in the United States. But in order for you to be white, according to Rashad Shabazz, Spatializing Blackness, one of the prerequisites is that you have to have anti-Black attitudes. You can't be a German white person. You can't be not a real white person, but an honorary white person, and then call yourself trying to ally with Black folks. Because part of whiteness in the United States at that time was being anti-Black, having a hatred towards Black people. And so a lot of what the Europeans did was they just adopted those same ideas. Okay, well, we're just gonna not like them either. We're gonna subscribe to the same stereotypes you have about them. And so non-American whites became part of the middle class. They started to adopt anti-Black ideas and behaviors, and they feared the low social status that they maintained in American society. And they didn't want to go back there. So they said, well, if we have to hate Black people, and if we have to have anti-Black attitudes and participate in prejudice in order to maintain our way of life, sure, we'll do it. And so 19th century scholarship concluded that Black people were these uncivil people, and slavery was needed to maintain order, because if we allowed them and left them to their own devices, they would, our country would be in shambles. And so you have books like Race Traits that warn white people, again, of the sexual immorality, the criminal nature of Black people, especially during the Great Migration, where more Black people are leaving the South and are going to Kansas City, Chicago, New York, Philly, even over to Los Angeles, Detroit, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, all these big cities. And they're saying, wow, there's way too many of them. They're coming in, they're taking over the city, they're taking our jobs, they're gonna need a place to stay, they're gonna wanna stay in the same neighborhoods as us. And if it was just a few, maybe we'll be okay, but there's literally millions of them across these cities up north. We gotta do something. We gotta do something. And so one of the things they did, and we have to do something because they are naturally criminals and they're naturally hypersexual, and we want to maintain the morality and the piety of our community and our women. So what tool do we use to control these people? Is we use policing. And policing was a tool to control Black people, number one, and then protect white people from their immoral behavior. So we keep them spatialized, and then we make sure that white people stay pure and pious and Christian and moral, so that they're not interacting with each other. And what are the ways that this policing occurs? It occurs through three formats. Number one, the format of consolidating carceral power in the Black community, keeping the hyper surveillance, keeping the hyper policing, keeping all of the law enforcement, all of the militia-like, prison-like formats of how people were confined in prisons in other countries, applying that to Black communities. So keeping that all in the Black communities. Number two, now we're going to consolidate whiteness. We're going to keep white people away from the Black belt, away from the Black areas of town. Now we're going to give them more land, so they have access to more land, but we're going to make sure that that is completely separate from where Black folks live. So we consolidate whiteness, but we spread whiteness. We concentrate Blackness into these small spaces. And then you organize the urban geography along these racial lines. So now you create roads, you create buildings, you create highways. I think you all looked at that. And how highways were created. I think this was this class, along racial lines. So you create highways, bridges, streets, roads, everything to separate one side of town versus another side of town, right? And again, you can see that in the very city that you're living in right now. You can see that if you're in Jacksonville, some of you may be in other places, but if you're in Jacksonville, Jacksonville is very much divided in those ways. You know what sides of town where there are going to be more white people, it's going to be more upper middle class. You know what sides of towns where it's not going to be. It's going to be more people of color, more Black people, sometimes more Black and Hispanic, depending on the area, more poor, more working class, right? And the urban geography is set up that way, particularly in Jacksonville, through bridges. So bridges tend to dictate what side of town people are going to live along racial lines and along class lines. And so then what Foucault talks about and Shabazz applies here is this notion of the panopticon. So now that we have spatialized Blackness, now that we have concentrated Black people on this Black belt, and we've used interracial sex as a means to do that, we've created whiteness, we've expanded whiteness. So now whiteness is not just for the US male, American male, it is for the European male as well, right? He now can come in, and as long as he's anti-Black, as long as he is contributing and paying taxes and helping to grow the country, then the European male can also come in and be white. Because again, for a long time, they were not considered white, only in the early part of the 20th century. And now it's very common for people to, you have people who run for presidents, like Donald Trump. I think his family's only been in the country for maybe a few generations, maybe dating back to the early 20th century, as opposed to my family, who's been here since the 19th century, and other people's family, particularly Black people whose families have been here since the 18th and maybe even 17th centuries, and still, are not treated as first-class citizens, which goes to show it's not about citizenship, it's about race, because you have Black families who've been here for centuries longer than a European family who may have come in the 1900s, and yet it's still they can get better treatment, better access to opportunities, better access to jobs, and could even be the president of the United States, right? Or is more likely to be the president of the United States, right? And so this goes to show that the creation of whiteness absolutely benefited European Americans as they began to come into and expand whiteness, and then use their white power to now incarcerate Black folks, not just in prisons, but in their own neighborhoods. You incarcerate them in their own neighborhoods, and part of the incarceration is not just confining them or spatializing them, but now you have to survey them. Now you have to watch them. And that's where we get into the idea of the panopticon. The panopticon on the next slide is the perfect prison, which is structured in such a way so that cells will be open to a central tower. And so what Foucault was talking about with the panopticon is he's saying these prisons that you all are creating have this one tower in the middle. You've probably seen it in movies and documentaries or whatever, or even pictures. But you have this one tower, and around it are all these cells. So if you go back to the slide I sent you, that is an example. Of the previous slide, Noodlebar and the Creation of Whiteness, that's an example. You see this one tower, and you see all those prison cells around it. And what that tower symbolized was the all-seeing eye. So you never knew who was in there. All you knew as a prisoner is that tower has somebody in there that controls me, that controls my movement, that controls where I go and what I do. And no matter what time of the day it is, Monday, morning, noon, or night, 24/7, somebody's in there that has power over what I can do. And that's called the panopticon. It's the all-seeing eye. So individuals in the space are constantly confronted by this panopticon, but they don't know who's in there. They just believe that somebody's in there. So sometimes, even in prisons, nobody's in that tower, but they don't know that because it's not necessarily about the person in the tower. It's about the belief that somebody is in there all the time, right? And so it's almost like when your parents, I don't know if you ever heard them say, I got eyes in the back of my head, or sometimes they just seem to know when you were younger, they just seem to know what you did when they weren't even in the room. And so it almost made you afraid if you were doing something wrong. Even if you know your parents aren't looking, you just kind of looked anyway, like, I don't know, I just feel like they might be here, even though you know they're not. That's fear. And that's fear of the panopticon. That's fear that your parents put inside you to say, you never know where I'm gonna be. You never know if you're gonna see me. And so this all-seeing surveillance was put in prisons to control prisoners, right? Well, Rashad Shabazz is saying, you've done that exact same thing to Black folks in the Black Belt in predominantly Black, predominantly poor communities, because there is so much hyper surveillance with police, right? That oftentimes, even when they're moving among their own people, they still don't feel as though they can be themselves, because there's this almost all-seeing racial eye that's saying, if I do something wrong, cops are just gonna come out of nowhere. Or how do I know they don't have cameras in those trees or have cameras in those telephone poles? How do I know? And you hear about phrases like big brother and things like that to say, how do I know that if I'm looking at my cell phone, somebody's not looking at me, or I'm looking in this camera and somebody's looking at me? right? And so we have this kind of panopticonic idea, even in the present day with technology. Some people may look at it as being, what do you call it? These exaggerated, you know, conspiracy theories, but a lot of people believe that it is true, right? And it's definitely true along racial lines, in that with the hyper surveillance, with the constant hyper policing in these predominantly Black communities, and not only hyper policing, but the abuse that many of these people took by police, it made them even scared to come outside, to interact with each other, because it was done so much that the fear of them being in their communities to begin with made interaction with each other, and particularly interracial interaction, even more difficult because of this panopticonic, all-seeing eye that was done through the hypersurveillance, the concentration of power, and the carcerality of Black neighborhoods. All right, so now we are moving to culture and space. And so, this is where we now transition from spatializing Blackness to culture and space. And so I want to start with the question. Have you ever entered into a space or a place that you realized you were not supposed to be in? I just want you to think about that. Have you ever gone somewhere, you walked in and you realized, oh, I'm supposed to be in here? Maybe it could be something as simple as walking into, you know, at one point, the wrong bathroom. If you identify as a male, but you walk into the woman's bathroom or vice versa, you walk in and you're like, oh, I'm sorry. You walk out. How did you know you weren't supposed to be there? Did somebody tell you? Did you realize it yourself? Were you embarrassed? Which goes to the next part. How did it make you feel? Were you embarrassed when you walked in the wrong place or some place where you weren't supposed to be? Were you embarrassed? Were you scared? Sometimes that can be scary. If you walk somewhere and it's like, whoa, I'm not supposed to be here. And being there could possibly lead to you being hurt. Did you respond by running away? Did you respond by staying there? Did you respond by trying to convince the people that you were interacting with in that space that you could be in that space even though you weren't supposed to be? So it's just something to think about. You can pause this video, you can think about it, you can talk about it with your roommate, friends, family, whatever. Just think about it. Have you ever entered into a space or place and you realized you weren't supposed to be there? And I'm gonna tell you a story. This past summer, I went to LA with some friends. And so we got had an Airbnb in Santa Monica, off the Santa Monica Pier. Because we wanted to stay on the beach. We wanted to, go to the beach, have a good time. And so that's what we wanted to do. So our Airbnb was really, really nice. Multiple rooms. Yeah, it was just really, really beautiful. And it was right there in Santa Monica, right on the beach. And so as we were pulling up, we're all Black. And it's mostly white people in this area. And so we pull up to the Airbnb, and a white woman who's walking her dog, comes out, and she has these two big dogs, and they look mean. And so she's walking with them up to us, up to our car, before we could even get out. And she says, "Excuse me, are you supposed to be here?" And we said, "Yes, we are." And we're looking at our paperwork. Yeah, we're supposed to be here. This is what we paid for. And he said, because I don't know if you're supposed to be here, and there are people who live here. And if you're trying to go to the beach, then you need to park over there and pay over there. And we said, no, we're not. Then at one point, my other friend told the other person, you don't have to answer her questions. Who is she? She doesn't need to know what we're doing. And so I told my other friend too, I said, we don't need to talk to her. But then the dogs started coming closer. Now, my other friend who's not afraid of dogs started to pet the dogs and play with the dogs. The dogs didn't bite her or anything, but she started to ask us more questions. So then my other friend, I didn't answer her, but then my other friend said, this is our Airbnb. We're supposed to be here. And immediately she said, oh, I'm so sorry. There have been people who've been parking here and they're not supposed to. And so I didn't know if you were among those people who were parking here, but you weren't supposed to. This is a beautiful beach and you're gonna love it. And if you need anything, I live right here, blah, blah, blah. And so when she left, I was upset. My other friend was upset that there was this assumption that we weren't supposed to be here. Now, it could have been for a number of reasons. One could say it was race. One could say the lady was racist. One could say that there were just a lot of people that regardless of our race, if we were white and parking there, that she would have done the same thing. We don't know if she would have or if she would not have. Not really sure, but it could very well be because we've seen examples, we've seen on social media and and in the media itself, in the news, of things like this happening to people of color, particularly Black people when they come into class spaces that seem to be out of their price range or whatever, right? And so it caused us, me and my friends now, to have a conversation about what that meant, right? Us living in the South, coming to LA, thinking that feeling that, wow, these things, we would likely see these things possibly in the South. LA doesn't seem to have a tradition of this. The racist tradition it seems to be more apparent in the South than it is on the West Coast, blah, blah, blah. All these different conversations we started to have around it. How this applies here, though, is regardless of why it happened, regardless of if it was initiated by race or if it was a class issue, whatever it was, property, place, you see the intersection of race and class and place happening in that moment. Also, the feeling that we had was also very significant because for a second, it put a damper on our trip. And we were very excited about this trip. We all needed a vacation. Now we're thinking, man, we don't want this to happen again. Now we have to think about, as Black people, being here in Santa Monica, being here in places that are much more expensive, what is this gonna look like? How are we gonna be treated? Now we have to think about all these things now as we're moving. So now it kind of puts a small damper on the trip, because now this is something we gotta think about. Now, if the police come, are we gonna have to always show them our paperwork? Things like that, right? And so being in a place or space that you realize you're not supposed to be in doesn't feel good. Doesn't feel good at all. Sometimes, right? Depending on the situation. With my situation, it did not feel good. And I was very angry, right? That happened, because shouldn't happen if when you pay and you're on vacation. And so when we look at notions of race and class and place, it's very easy to talk about it theoretically, but when you're actually in those situations, and people treat you as if you're not supposed to be somewhere, or that now you have to ask questions to somebody who is not your legal authority. So technically we did not have to talk to her, but because of this racial dynamic and this woman's authoritarian tone, because of her whiteness, right? And maybe because of things that we had been through as Black people, there was this almost natural inferior superior relationship happening, even though it wasn't real, right? And so it caused a lot of conversation. It caused us to think, and it put a small damper on certain parts of our trip. With that being said, again, place is big. Places still exist today, and place making and place strategies and place rules still exist even now. So imagine that feeling that maybe I had or maybe you've had, if you can think of that now. And then imagine having that feeling regularly throughout your entire life. That same feeling that you had of where can I go? Where can I be myself? If I go here, somebody gonna say something to me? Let me hype myself up so that if they say something to me, I automatically respond as an equal and not as an inferior person. And if I respond as an inferior person, now I'm mad at myself. Why did I even respond to that person? I didn't have to explain anything to that person. Now I feel bad. Now I'm coming down on myself. And it's not me, it's that person. Why did they have to treat me this way? All these things are happening inside the minds of people who are in spaces that they're not supposed to be in. With that being said, we are going to watch the McKinney, Texas pool party incident. Now I have two links. The first link is just a quick, not blurb, but it is a news showing about the Texas pool party incident, right? So you have just a quick story about it, so it's not that long, where the anchors are watching it and are talking about it. I want to say it's maybe 3 minutes long, 3 to 4 minutes long. That second link, though, is 7 minutes. It's the actual raw footage of the McKinney, Texas pool incident. And so if you read the reading, I wanted you to actually be able to see it as opposed to just read about it. But if you read the reading, and we'll talk about it in a second, at least after you watch this first link, then we'll talk about what actually happened if you didn't read it. And so that is what we're getting ready to watch right now, is this McKinney, Texas, a part of this McKinney, Texas pool incident. All right.
A police officer in the Dallas suburb of McKinney, Texas, is on administrative leave tonight after he was caught on tape pulling a gun on a group of teenagers and wrestling one of them, a young girl, to the ground. More now from Brian New of our CBS Dallas Fort Worth station, KTVT.
Cell phone video captured the takedown. McKinney police officer Eric Casebolt forced 14-year-old Jajari Becton's face into the grass twice and placed both knees on her back.
I'm guessing he thought we were saying rude stuff to him, and I was like telling him that he can get off me because my back was hurting really bad.
The police were called after an argument turned into a fight over who had permission to be at the pool. Officers tried to corral some of the teenagers with little success.
Don't take off running when the cops get here.
That's when Casebolt, a patrol supervisor, arrived.
Y'all make me run around here with 30 pounds of damn gear on the sun because you want to screw around out here?
He also pulled his weapon on two unarmed boys. All the teens were released to their parents. And today, Jahi Bakari, the father of one of the girls, expressed outrage.
This guy was just out of control. He should be drug tested, then fired. But he shouldn't keep his job. And I'm not going to stop until he is fired.
On Sunday, Police Chief Conley said the department is investigating how it escalated so fast.
It's something we're going to have to look into to determine, what we're training as far as the officers and their reaction on the scene. Anytime you confront a large group of people, it's a very dynamic situation, and tensions can rise very quickly.
Community organizers say they believe that race may have played a role because the officer didn't try to apprehend any of the white teens who were also there. Charlie, they have asked the Department of Justice to investigate. Thanks, Brian. A police
Okay. So you can see the raw footage and much more of the footage in the next link. And you will have an assignment about this. So you can either watch either one. So what are some things you noticed in the video? Just from that news clip, right? Obviously, you need a little bit more to make final conclusions, and that's why I provided the raw footage there. And then, but just based off of what you saw, what are some things you noticed? And think about, I don't know, just think about everything, right? Think about who's there, think about who's being arrested, think about who's being pushed to the ground, think about race, think about class, think about place, all of these things that we've been discussing, think about gender. And did anything related to race jump out at you, right? You can think about the very clear things, like the race of the officers versus the race of the students, or the kids. But then you can start thinking about some other things as well. Anything that surprises you or jumps out at you. So you can pause the video, unpause it, and what we're going to talk about is Barbara Combs, who writes this article, her notion of bodies out of place. And going to the next slide, we see that bodies out of place is the framework that is used in this article to explain what is happening at this intersection of race and place and class and gender, right? First thing that's important to know is that space makes place possible. So the spaces that we're in, the spaces that we inhabit makes place and who is allowed to enter into certain place possible. So the spaces are the geographical areas that we inhabit, and then place is the cultural, social norms that are associated with that area. So the pool space, right, exists. And then who is allowed to go into that pool at what times is what makes place possible. The pool space is a place with a pool, but then placing it in a predominantly white middle-class neighborhood says, these are the people, these are the placed ideas, these are the place-making elements of this space. And this is done in many different ways. Spaces, you have spaces where you use the bathroom, but if you put up whites only, colored only signs, now you're putting place-making elements around these spaces that tells you who can go into what bathroom. Carceral functions maintain both places and the liminal spaces that preserve them. Now, when we say liminal spaces, what we're saying is like the hallways, right? Like, for example, if you go from one room of your house to another room of your house, you may have to go down a hallway to get from the bedroom to the living room or whatever. That's called a liminal space, right? And so carceral functions are put in place to maintain places and the liminal spaces. We talked about carceral functions as how power is reinforced through law enforcement, reinforced through urban geography, reinforced through gang violence, right? How these various forms of carceral power and hypersurveillance are used to maintain control over spaces, places, and even the areas that allow you to go from one physical space to another. So surveillance of the area and the people that produce it, or surveillance of an area, produces two types of people: normal people or normal bodies and abnormal bodies. So when you're hyper surveilling an area, there are two things you're looking for: who belongs here and who doesn't. When that woman came up to me and my friends, it was very clear. Do these people belong here or do they not? If they do, I'm going to leave them alone. If they don't, I'm going to confront them and tell them that they should move. Right? So normal and abnormal bodies. The normal bodies, they can do whatever they want in that space. When we were seen as people who were normal, and what made us normal was our class status, we paid. So because we paid for our normality, and now we can go to the beach, we can go to the Airbnb, we can sit outside, we can do whatever we want now, because now we proved to her our normality, our humanity. Surveillance also looks for abnormal bodies, who's not supposed to be here. And whoever is not supposed to be here, they're going to be marked with heightened surveillance. So now if I don't feel like you deserve to be here and in this place or in this space, now I'm going to tell you you shouldn't. And if you don't move, now I'm going to call the police. And now there's even more surveillance around whether you should be here or not. And so because of this hyper surveillance, because of this bodies out of place framework, people of color have to navigate white space with a lot of care. Because white space is growing, white space is expanding. And so the maintenance and the expansion of white space helps in preserving white supremacy. So individual white people may lack power, a white person of a lower class may lack power, but the fact that they are white gives them the privilege to move throughout that space. There could have been a white person who maybe could not have afforded to purchase that Airbnb. But if they were white, it's a good chance she may not have asked them or confronted them in the way that she confronted us. Again, we don't know, but based on history, based on what we see, based on evidence, that's a likely conclusion. And so then organizations that are steeped in white culture and white logic manifest whiteness and white supremacy through policies, through practices, and through leadership. And so because whiteness and white spaces are constantly growing and expanding and growing, people of color have to be very mindful of how they interact. Because one false move, go to the next slide, and these things can happen. One false move, if you're seen as an abnormal body in a white space, you could be Trayvon Martin. If you're an abnormal body in a white space, you could be Ahmaud Arbery. Trayvon Martin, unarmed Black kid, killed in Sanford, Florida, because he was an abnormal body in a white space. Ahmaud Arbery, jogging in his neighborhood, killed by 2 white men in Georgia because he was an abnormal body in a white space. Jordan Davis, shot to death in Jacksonville, Florida by a white man because his music was too loud, but also it was done in the white side of town. He was an abnormal body in a white space. Natasha Harlins, a young Black woman who was shot in the back of the head by a Korean grocery store owner. She was an abnormal body in a white space, even though it was owned by a Korean woman. The space itself, the whiteness of the area, seen as she was a body out of place. She wasn't supposed to be there. She said that the Korean lady accused her of stealing orange juice. And when they found her body, she had the money in her hand. She was getting ready to give the lady the money. George Floyd, abnormal body in a white space, killed. And so it's important for us to see where this bodies out of place framework comes from. And it comes out of the tradition of critical race theory. Obviously, we've been hearing a lot about critical race theory. There has been a huge push to take critical race theory out of our classrooms, take it out of the college classrooms, take it out of the high school classrooms. Yeah, but here it is, critical race theory. Critical race theory was a theoretical framework that was developed out of legal scholarship. There was a time where I would say maybe the 70s, law students, particularly Black law students, were taking these classes. And these were in Ivy League institutions, your Harvards, your Cornells, your Princetons. They were taking classes and they were hearing about race, and the way in which race was explained was that while race and racism did exist in US society, law was the great neutralizer. As long as you came before the judge, race was not going to dictate what was going to happen to you and what kind of sentence you were going to have. The law was the great equalizer. The law, and under the law, everything was going to be the same. If you didn't do anything wrong, you wouldn't be punished. If you did do something wrong, you would be punished, regardless of your racial background. Well, this was shortly after the Civil Rights Movement, so now more African Americans are having a chance to go to law school and to go to these predominantly white law schools. So they're listening to these lectures and they're like, huh, that's not how it is where I come from. That wasn't how it is with my father or my mother or my grandfather or my auntie or my uncle or my cousin. I have a cousin who's doing 5 years, 10 years now for a crime they didn't commit because they were with me when they said the crime was done, but he's still doing 10 years. So I don't know if that works. I don't think so. So these same law students would then leave law school. They would become lawyers and law professors and get tenure and do all these things. And then they came back and they were like, we need to change the way race is being taught because it's not right and it's not relevant. And so they started to publish research, do research, and publish research. And they created a theoretical framework to correct the way in which race and racism was taught in the college classrooms. And they came up with this notion of critical race theory. And the tenets of critical race theory gave us a more critical analysis of how race and racism was taught from a legal standpoint. And these were the main tenets of critical race theory. Number one, racism is ingrained in the fabric and the system of American society. No longer are we going to talk about it as a means of how one person interacts with another person. Race and racism comes from systems. And that system is fed through personal interaction. So the fabric and the system of American society is racist. And we kind of talked about that. I think we talked about it in this class in the beginning when we discussed systemic racism and racist America, blah, 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 right? So that's critical race theory. When we were talking about systemic racism, that's out of the tradition of critical race theory. The individual races need not exist to note that institutional racism is pervasive in the dominant culture. You can magically make everybody non-racist. And guess what? The country's still racist. Why? Because the foundation is racist. The traditions are racist. The systems that created it were racist. You have to change the entire system. You have to change the very fabric of the country in order for you to be able to really stop talking about or get rid of racism. Power structures are based on white privileges and white supremacy, which perpetuates the marginalization of people of color. Therefore, any power structure, the legal system, the economic system, the educational system, the medical industry, the housing market, anything, the religious structures, all of these things are created, whether consciously or subconsciously. Well, they were created consciously, and whether they're perpetuated consciously or subconsciously, as a means of promoting and extending white privilege, white supremacy, and whiteness, and allowing for the advancement of white people. In return, it was created and can be consciously or subconsciously perpetuated to marginalize people of color. And then lastly, critical race theory rejects traditions of liberalism and meritocracy. Ideas that suggest that all men are created equal, no. Critical race theory says that's not the case, not in this country at least. Yes, humanly, yes, if you believe you were created by God or the Big Bang, yes, we are all created equally, but all people are not treated equally. So it rejects these theories of abstract liberalism. It also rejects theories of meritocracy, that everybody gets to a place of success only off their merits, and that's not true. While merits play a role in why you're successful in college, why you got into college, some of you got here also because of your privilege. Either your white privilege, your male privilege, your class privilege. even me being in front of you, although I'm Black, so they were racial barriers that I had to overcome to be here in front of you. I had a certain male privilege that allows me to have a better relationship and better experiences with being an assistant professor than many of my Black women counterparts. And they tell me stories and I'm like, I did not know that you deal with that. And they're like, oh yeah, it's bad. The ease it is for me to get jobs than it is for them to get jobs, because it can be very difficult for Black women professors or women professors of another minority group. So there's privilege everywhere. And critical race theory accepts that that privilege exists and rejects the ideas that meritocracy that everybody comes to a level of success solely based off of their merit. And so the bodies out of place themes that Barbara Harris Combs talks about in the McKinney, Texas incident, that is how she lays out the rest of the paper. She says there are 8 themes. Number 1, racism is systemic and deeply ingrained in society. We've talked about that. We just talked about that. Whites falsely equate physical integration with social integration. So one of the bodies out of place themes says, many white people believe just because you have a large group of very racially diverse people in an area does not necessarily mean that it's truly integrated. You can have a university that has Black people, white people, Latinx people, Native American people, Asian people. But then guess what? If your board of trustees are male, female, men, women, non-binary people, gay, straight, bisexual, you can have all these people on campus. But if all of your board of trustees are white male, most of your professors are white, if not like 90, 95% of your professors are white. The students may be diverse, but then all of your staff and the people who clean up are Black, and the people who cut the yards are Black. Is that true integration? I don't think so. No. I don't think that's true integration. You have a lot of people in one place, but is there a real working together? And most spaces are like that. There are very few spaces that have really true integration, and not just integration racially, but also in genders and through other social identities, but through ways of thinking. Do you have people who are right thinking, people who are left thinking, people who are middle thinking? Do you have people who are conservative, people who are liberal, people who are a little bit of both? That is really when you start to get into true integration and true diversity and inclusion. Whites have a possessive investment in colorblind frames. White people invest in it. Why? Because they benefit from it financially, socially. And so keeping things colorblind, keeping people saying, I don't see race, race doesn't exist, racism doesn't exist. White people have a possessive investment in that. Then there's a macro-micro connection to racism. It is sustained on a micro level, but operates on a macro level, meaning one can't just say, well, this McKinney, Texas incident, even if a person did agree that there were racial implications here, that's just one officer. We just have to get rid of those bad apples. No, it operates on a micro level. Yes, there are some bad police officers who do things and who have racist tendencies and who practice those racist tendencies. And yes, they should be fired, and not only fired, but charged, and whatever crime they committed, they should be put in jail and held to the fullest extent of the law. But there's also a macro level happening as well, because there are people on the top level who either support it, don't say anything, allow it to happen, allow these complaints to go across their desk, and it continues to happen over and over again. And if they get charged, or if they come in front of a judge, and if they, by some miracle, are found guilty, sometimes for killing somebody, they may get 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. But if they did not have a badge, and if they were of another color, they would have gotten life. So we have to be mindful that yes, there are these micro level interactions, but there's also a larger system and structure that allows for these things to continue, or to continue with very little punishment, very little punitive damages. Bodies are out of place in relation to other bodies. So the bodies that are seen to be out of place, particularly in this McKinney, Texas incident, where it appears as though these Black bodies were seen to be out of place, even though there were white people who were also at this pool party, they were not the ones who were being chased, had a gun pulled out on them. And so in relationship to, and it was also a white person who filmed this, the Black bodies were out of place in relationship to the fact that there were white bodies there. Sometimes a body may not be out of place if it's the only kind of body that's there. But once another kind of body, once another racialized body, once a white body is now in contact with a non-white, once a white body comes in contact with a non-white body, then maybe that's where the problem occurs. Going back to the Black and Tans and back to the sex districts. Having sex clubs in predominantly Black communities, nobody cares. They didn't care about that at the time. Black people, they could have illicit sex all day, I don't care. But now when the white bodies come in and now they're doing it, oh wait, pull the police out, break it up, arrest those people, the Black people. This shouldn't be happening. Take away the liquor license, done away with it. So bodies are out of place in relationship to whatever other bodies are in that space. Perceived out of place bodies evoke a response. So once it was thought of that, wow, these bodies are out of place, these kids aren't supposed to be here, particularly these Black kids, it's a response. Somebody calls the police come out. And they don't come out nice. They come out and they're chasing the kids around and they're pulling out guns. Now the response is violent. As soon as we realize there's a body out of place, there's a response. When we pulled up at the Airbnb, the lady came up to us and there was a response. Are you supposed to be here? Then out of that response comes our response. We don't have to talk to you. Then another response. Oh, well, I guess we can explain. Then out of that comes our response to each other. Why did we explain ourselves to her? She ain't nobody, she ain't no authority, she ain't no police officer. Who she thinks she is? So now all of these responses are happening because there is a perception that bodies are out of place. Colorblind logics justify the response. The idea that, well, just like I said earlier, well, what if race didn't play a role? That wasn't a colorblind idea. It was just me thinking, let me try to be as politically correct or as unbiased as I possibly can. But a colorblind would say, well, if race isn't a part of the equation at all, then she has a right to do that. Or the police have a right to come out and round up all the Black people. Why? Because racism doesn't exist. And the intersectional bodies produce intersectional responses. Because as we can see, it wasn't just about race in the McKinney Pool, Texas incident. It's also about class. The pool was in a predominantly middle-class white neighborhood. Had it been in a poor white neighborhood, would it have been as bad? Probably not. Gender. One of the bigger stories within the McKinney, Texas pool incident is that this white man has his knees he's on top of this Black girl who is in a bathing suit. So now there's this gender dynamic as well, right? And so you have race, you have class, you have gender, and then of course we've been talking about place. So all of these intersectional identities coming together, happening here, means when we respond, we need to respond intersectionally. That means we need to look at place, we need to look at race, we need to look at class, we need to look at gender, we need to look at sexuality, all of these things as they're being played out here, right? So with that being said, web assignment, bodies out of place. And a 1 to 2 page paper, well, I kind of did it already, I didn't mean to, but you are required to take 4 themes from the previous slide. So looking at those 8 themes, 4 themes from the previous slide and explain how each one plays out in the video. So I kind of gave you some already. I didn't mean to do that, but oh well. Hopefully you choose some different ways though. You can watch both the first and second video. So the two links that I gave you, can watch the first and second one to provide your explanation. And then you do a paragraph for each theme for your explanation and discuss what happened in the video and how it relates to that theme. So remember, I gave you two links, two YouTube links. You can watch both of them. And then you can start to complete your assignment. I want you to talk about how does each theme help us better understand the race, place, class, and gender interactions in this video. Okay. So explain how each theme, four themes are played out, one paragraph for each theme, or you can do 1 to 2 paragraphs for each theme, however you want to do it. And then I want you to answer that question. The paper should be double spaced, Times New Roman, 12 font. Only information that should be at the top, your name, the name of the class, title of the essay, optional. The deadline for uploading this assignment to the web assignment portal is September 17th. Sorry. Yes, I'll give you till September 17th. September 17th, 3 p.m. So I'll give you till Friday to do it. Typically it'll be a Monday, Wednesday thing, but I'll give you till Friday. Okay. All right, with that being said, look forward to seeing you in office hours, talking with you via email or corresponding with you via email or inbox. If you have any questions, reach out to me. Soon I will be talking about your papers. If you have any questions, you can always ask me, but I will talk about them very soon. Just wanted to get through a few readings so that you all had a good idea of what we're talking about, race, place, and all these different intersections. So now we're getting ready to talk a little bit about the paper. So be prepared to see a lecture for that coming up very soon. And it'll probably be a separate video, but be prepared to see that soon. All right. Have a great week. Have a great weekend. And you'll see me soon.